Samuel Hart stepped onto the jet bridge, humming with the muted roar of engines and the soft thump of rolling suitcases. He moved with the quiet assurance of a man who'd spent 40 years navigating airports around the world, from icy hangars in North Dakota to sun-baked runways in Florida. He wore a tailored navy sweater that fit him like a second skin, pressed khaki slacks and polished brown loafers, each stitch visible in the overhead lights. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed back, and wire-rimmed glasses perched on the bridge of his nose gave him a scholarly air. In his right hand, he held a first-class ticket folded into a neat rectangle. In his left, a navy duffel that had accompanied him through decades of business trips. He paused at the door to the cabin, inhaling a deep breath of conditioned air that smelled faintly of leather polish and coffee. Even at 65, Samuel tasted every nuance. As he stepped forward, a young flight attendant named Kendra snapped the door shut behind him. He caught only a flash of her sharp cheekbones, her tight blonde bun, the crispness of her uniform. But from that instant, he sensed her attitude would be the same all flight. Samuel walked down the narrow aisle until he reached row 2. He stopped at seat 2C, placed his bag on the floor for a moment, and then lifted it toward the overhead compartment. A twinge in his left shoulder reminded him of the long run between gates at Love Field earlier that afternoon. His shoulder was stiff from 3 back-to-back meetings and hauling luggage like this one. In a calm, measured voice, soft enough to carry courtesy but firm enough to be heard, he said, "Miss, would you please help me with this bag?" He tilted his head in her direction. Kendra glanced over her shoulder without pausing her stride. Her name tag caught the light. Kendra. She didn't smile. Instead, she scanned him from the top of his neatly trimmed hair to the tip of his polished shoe, folding her arms as if she were judging his worthiness. Then she muttered under her breath, loud enough for the man in 2A to turn and look. "You people always want something." Samuel froze for a heartbeat. He'd learned long ago that with some people no amount of courtesy changed their minds, yet he held on to that same calm. He gave his bag one gentle nudge upward and slipped it into place himself, then slid into the window seat. He settled in, smoothing out the fabric of his sweater as the engines roared to life and the plane prepared to taxi. By the time the safety demonstration started, Kendra walked past his row without making a single eye contact. She paused at the exit row, cocked her hip, and flashed a practiced smile at a man in 1A who wore a sleek charcoal suit. "I'll skip you," she told him with bright cheer. "Looks like you've got it all under control." She laughed, the sound sharp against the hum of the engines. Samuel's jaw twitched only slightly, just enough that she might have seen if she'd bothered to look. He closed his eyes briefly and let out a quiet sigh. At that height, 30,000 feet above ground, it was supposed to feel like a calm bubble, away from the world's troubles. Instead, the bubble felt lopsided. An old man left out of the comfort he'd paid for. A few rows ahead, the beverage cart rolled slowly. The flight attendant paused beside the overhead bins, clicked her tongue, then turned to Samuel's row. She leaned just a bit as if he were invisible and asked the man in 2A, "Coffee, sir?" The man, a software consultant from Palo Alto judging by his laptop stickers, nodded and adjusted his glasses. She poured black coffee into a 12-ounce cup and slid it down to him with a polite smile. Samuel cleared his throat. "Excuse me? I'd like a coffee, please." Kendra straightened, glanced at him and said, "Sir, we're very busy." She snapped her head toward the consultant in 2A and began pouring cranberry juice into his glass, ignoring Samuel entirely. The consultant shifted in his seat, staring straight ahead, wanting no part of it. Samuel stared down at his empty tray table, his hands folded neatly. He was not angry, at least not yet, but his mind ticked through every slight, every silence. He remembered the first time he'd flown this airline as a young captain. Back then, he'd been a fighter pilot in the Air Force, leaping from flight suits into business casual in a matter of months. He'd learned leadership on the runway and negotiation in the cockpit. He'd dined with mayors, advised boards of directors, and spent late nights in chilly hangars waiting for his crew. Yet here, in what was supposed to be his own airline's first-class cabin, he felt unseen. As the plane leveled out, Samuel retrieved a copy of Fast Company from the seat back pocket in front of him. He thumbed through articles about customer loyalty programs and market differentiation, but words blurred on the page. His eyes kept drifting to Kendra as she laughed with a couple in 1B, talking about her dog and the latest reality show. Her energy brightened for them, genuine and warm, but when she glanced back toward his row, her expression turned hard, almost like stone falling. He returned the magazine to his lap and sat with his back straight. He watched other passengers out of the corner of his eye. The woman in 1B looked back over her shoulder at him once, eyebrows knitted, then shifted uncomfortably. A man in 3A leaned toward his neighbor and whispered something, nodding toward Samuel. The neighbor nodded and looked away. No one wanted to step into the space. No one wanted to say, "That's not right." Samuel closed his eyes, leaned his head against the seat, and let himself feel the heat rising in his face. He was no stranger to calling out injustice, but he also knew the cost of speaking up when everyone else shrank back. He counted silently, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. He reminded himself of his old mentor's words. "Sam, the sky will always reveal who people really are. Up there, they think no one's watching." He opened his eyes and met a reflection in the window. An older man, lean and composed, but his shoulders tensed. About 10 minutes later, Kendra reappeared with that same beverage cart. She held a paper cup of coffee like it was a rotten apple. She set it on his tray with an exaggerated flourish, some drops splashing onto the plastic surface. She snapped, "Here's your coffee. Hope it's strong enough for you." Then she turned on her heel and walked away. Samuel took the cup and inhaled the aroma of dark roast. He lifted it to his lips, just a sip, and found it bitter, but not as bitter as Kendra's tone. He replaced the lid and set it aside. He glanced at the cabin ceiling, counting signs. Fasten seat, belts, no smoking. Everything was in its right place, except the one moment of human cruelty just inches away. Then came the real blow. Kendra leaned over him again, this time bending at the waist so her face hovered above his shoulder. "I don't mean to offend," she said loudly, "but you're not exactly the usual type we get in this section. Are you sure you're on the right ticket?" The cabin fell silent. The hum of the engines seemed to drop. The consultant in 3A stopped tapping on his laptop. Even the couple in 1A turned their heads. Samuel felt a spike of heat, an anger refined by decades of self-control. He sat upright, removed his glasses, and fixed his gaze on her. "What type of passenger do you usually get?" he asked in a calm, measured voice. She blinked, taken aback, her cheeks pinked. She glanced down the row, then forced a bright tone. "Business travelers, executives, not people who think they can sneak up here on a whim." He leaned forward, one hand still cradling the coffee cup. "I didn't sneak," he said. "You may check my boarding pass if that will put your mind at ease." Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out her scanner and waved it over his pass. The green light blinked. She straightened and returned the scanner to her belt. All good," she stammered, then muttered under her breath so only he could hear. "Typical." Samuel set his cup down, feeling both the humiliation and a fierce determination swirled together. He thought about every time he'd pushed through barriers, time in segregated dining halls, time as the only black pilot on base, time waiting for a promotion he'd earned but never spoken of. He'd risen through the ranks with patience and unshakable calm. But patience was a two-edged sword, and sometimes the quietest men carried the sharpest blades. He leaned back, folded his arms and watched the downward glow of the sun through the window as the plane began its descent over the rolling hills near Bakersfield. He felt Kendra's eyes on him again, and he turned to look her straight in the face. Her expression flickered between anger and fear as the reality set in that he was more than the stereotype she tried to confine him to. A bead of sweat trembled at her temple. He let the silence stretch, letting everyone else in first class feel the tension he'd carried alone these past 40 minutes. Around him, a few passengers shifted in their seats. A woman in 2A tapped her hand against her armrest, then shut her eyes. A man in 4C quietly cleared his throat and glanced at the aisle. Samuel took a slow breath and pressed the call button above his head. Kendra looked over, panic flashing in her eyes. When she arrived, he said in that calm voice that silenced her, "Please, have your purser come here." Her lips parted, then snapped shut. She stepped back, pressed the button for assistance, and stood with her head down. The other flight attendants began to notice, pausing in their tasks. The purser, a tall woman with warm brown skin and a gentle manner, approached. "Is there something wrong, sir?" she asked. Samuel held up his coffee cup, the plastic lid still stained with Kendra's careless pour. "I've been repeatedly ignored, mocked, and subjected to outright discourtesy by your colleague," he said. "I expect to be treated with dignity and respect. I am not a novelty, I am not a mistake, and I did not sneak into this cabin." He laid the boarding pass on his tray table. All eyes in first class were on him now, their quiet complicity dissolved into attentive concern. The purser glanced at the pass, then back at Kendra. Kendra's face had drained of color, her shoulders shook. Samuel looked back to the window as the ground drew closer. His heart pounded not with anger, but with resolute calm. He would address this injustice the way he'd handled every challenge in life, with dignity, unwavering resolve, and the power of the truth. And when they landed, he would ensure that this moment did not pass unnoticed. For the first time all flight, Samuel Hart felt the atmosphere shift from one of casual prejudice to collective accountability. He had chosen his response carefully, sparking a confrontation that would expose the real story. As the wheels touched down, he allowed himself a small, inward smile. His journey had only just begun. Samuel Hart stepped down the jet bridge into the crisp San Francisco morning light, his navy duffel slung over one shoulder. Reporters' cameras flashed as he descended, but he ignored them, eyes fixed on the two Norjet supervisors at the bottom. Alan Ricks offered a firm handshake. Terry McAllister stood beside him, her posture tight. Samuel inhaled the salt air off the bay, then looked them both in the eye. "I expect 3 things," he said, voice low but unmistakable. "True accountability, full transparency, real change." He paused, letting each word settle. "Anything less is a betrayal of every passenger we serve." They nodded. On cue, Alan flipped open his tablet. "The internal review will begin immediately. We've already suspended Ms. Whitlow and started revising our training protocols." Samuel listened, but remained silent. Behind him, a small crowd of onlookers murmured. Nora Hawthorne appeared at the terminal door, eyes bright with both relief and sorrow. She approached, carrying a slim manila folder. "Mr. Hart, I drafted a statement on behalf of all cabin crew," she offered. He took it, thumbed to the final paragraph. "Our commitment must be more than words. We pledge to honor the dignity of every human being above all else, and to hold ourselves accountable when we fail." He looked up at Nora. "Thank you," he said. "But I want to include the voices of our passengers too, those who spoke up when they saw injustice. Let's invite them into our council, starting today." Her eyes widened, then warmed with admiration. Back at Norjet's downtown offices that afternoon, Samuel walked the gleaming halls toward his corner suite. Every Norjet employee, from custodians to gate agents, knew by now that their new CEO had just experienced a violent act in his own cabin. Word traveled faster than any press release. As he passed groups of employees, heads dipped respectfully. Inside his office, he closed the door and sank into his leather chair, His phone buzzed with headlines. Airline CEO slapped by flight attendant. What he did next shocks the industry. He resisted the urge to read them. Instead, he opened a blank document titled Project Flight Integrity. He began typing. Immediate revision of first class and coach service protocols with built-in bias checkpoints. Quarterly pass-the-mic sessions where real passengers share experiences directly with leadership. Mandatory empathy workshops led by psychologists and community leaders. Creation of passenger-led advisory board with voting power on policy changes. Transparent performance metrics for all employees published quarterly. He paused, staring at the list. It was ambitious, but necessary. He added one final line. Personal ride-along tours with employees at every level, quarterly. He saved the document and booked a flight for the following week to sit and coach on a red-eye anonymously. He would see how everyday travelers were treated without anyone knowing his identity. Meanwhile, Kendra Whitlow sat alone in an empty HR conference room, her badge removed. She stared at a single sheet of paper, the formal notice of her suspension and the allegations of assault. Her uniform had been replaced by a plain polo and slacks. Her hands trembled as she folded and refolded the notice. A soft knock sounded at the door and HR's Maritza entered, gentle but firm. "Kendra, I'm here to listen," she said in a calm tone. Kendra swallowed. I don't know what happened," she whispered. "He was so calm, I thought he was lying." Tears sprang to her eyes. "I'm so sorry." Maritza sat beside her. That calm anger, that quiet dignity, it's what makes this so powerful. You crossed a line, but you can choose how to move forward. This is a chance to learn who you really are. She slid a brochure across the table. Restorative Justice Circles. "I recommend you join this," Maritza said. "You'll meet those you've hurt, hear their stories, and share yours." Kendra lifted her head, voice shaking. "Will they hate me?" Maritza replied. "They might, but healing begins when we face the truth and take responsibility." Kendra nodded, the first inkling of hope sparking in her chest. That evening, Samuel convened his first pass-the-mic session in Norjet's glass-walled auditorium. He invited 10 passengers who'd spoken up on the flight, Nora and a cross-section of cabin crew. The stage held simple chairs in a circle. Samuel took his place in the middle. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "Last week I sat among you as a passenger. You witnessed an act of injustice and you spoke up. That courage is now at the heart of Norjet's future. Today is about listening." One by one, passengers, an elderly couple, a businesswoman, a software engineer, shared how they'd felt fear, shame, confusion when Kendra ignored the CEO. When she slapped him, they admitted they'd wanted to intervene but hesitated. A young software consultant said, "I felt powerless until I saw others speak up." A retired school teacher named Marge said, "We owe it to each other to stand up." Nora then spoke, voice trembling. "I want to apologize. I lost sight of my duty to serve everyone with respect." She looked at Kendra, who was seated in the back, attending under guard of HR. Kendra's eyes filled with tears. Samuel closed the circle. "This is how change starts. Not with policy mandates, but with shared humanity. We will carry these stories into every training, every board meeting, every flight. That is our promise." Over the next weeks, Norjet implemented changes at breakneck speed. Flight attendants received immersive bias awareness training where they experienced microaggressions firsthand in virtual reality simulations. Customers received emails inviting them to join the advisory board. Samuel piloted the first CEO and coach flight, disguised in a hat and glasses, listening at the back to passenger feedback. He learned how cramped the seats felt, how overhead bins balked under weight, how cabin temperature swung from freezing to stifling. He jotted notes for improvements. At corporate headquarters, the Project Flight Integrity dashboard went live on the intranet. Employees could see real-time feedback scores, diversity metrics, and incident reports. The board, initially wary of public transparency, applauded as customer satisfaction scores jumped 10 points in a month. Share prices ticked upward, not for the slap, but for the response. Meanwhile, social media continued to burn. Kendra's defenders, few but vocal, claimed the video was edited, cry-bullying, or misinterpreted. But the majority hailed Norjet's swift action. A viral hashtag, #DignityTheSky, trended, accompanied by passengers' selfies in first class, thumbs up, captioned, "No place for prejudice." In a poignant twist, a young flight attendant of Filipino descent posted her own story, how she'd been mocked for her accent on another flight, how she'd been too afraid to speak up, until she saw what collective courage looked like at 30,000 feet. Her post closed with, "We rise or we fall by how we treat each other. Today, we rise." 3 months after the incident, Norjet hosted a First Class for All gala aboard a stationary 747 at SFO's old hangar. Samuel delivered a keynote. "Our mission is simple. Every passenger deserves dignity. Every employee deserves respect," he introduced Kendra, who'd completed her restorative justice circle, apologized in person to Samuel, and shared her transformation. "I thought I knew what respect meant. I was wrong. Now I see how every human deserves to be valued from the moment they step on board." The audience rose in a standing ovation. Flight crew, executives, passengers, and community leaders side by side. The gala concluded with the unveiling of Norjet's new Diversity and Respect Charter, signed by every crew member and displayed on every aircraft. Nearly a year later, Samuel sat again in seat 2C, this time on a quiet red-eye to Miami. The flight attendant smiled warmly, saying, "Coffee, Mr. Hart?" He smiled back. "Thank you, Nora." She set down a steaming cup of dark roast and turned to serve the next passenger. Samuel gazed out the window at the stars, feeling proud, not of the slap that started it, but of the movement that followed. He thought of every passenger who'd spoken up, every colleague who'd changed, every system rewritten. He recalled his mentor's words, "The sky reveals who we are." He realized it also reveals who we can become. And as the engines hummed beneath him, he raised his cup in a silent toast to dignity, to courage, and to a future where no one ever wonders if they belong in first class again. Samuel Hart stared at the blinking cursor on his laptop screen well into the early morning hours. The hotel room was quiet, but his mind was racing through every headline that had flashed across the news feeds in the past 24 hours. CEO assaulted on flight by employee. Flight attendant suspended after attacking airline exec. Black airline CEO mistaken for wrong kind of passenger. Each headline punched at his ribs like Kendra's open-handed slap had punched his cheek. But Samuel's anger was no longer the raw sting of humiliation. It had become something colder and more purposeful. A resolve to turn his personal ordeal into a seismic shift across every cabin and terminal in the country. He sipped the black coffee that Nora had pressed into his hand before disembarkation. The bitterness was grounding, almost comforting. Outside, San Francisco's fog had rolled in, wrapping the city in its damp coolness. Samuel blinked twice and closed his laptop. He needed to set this story's final chapter in motion, not just for himself, but for every passenger who had ever felt invisible at 30,000 feet. He set his feet firmly on the plush carpet, slid the laptop into his briefcase, and prepared to go public, not with outrage or a demand for vengeance, but with a clarion call for justice that would leave no room for excuses or forgetfulness. By mid-morning, Samuel found himself in a cramped corner booth at a nondescript coffee shop 2 blocks from the Chronicle's offices. The reporter, a seasoned journalist named Margaret Lang with silver hair and a voice like worn leather, settled across from him, notebook open. The cafe's chatter washed over them. Espresso machines hissed, pastry trays clinked, and commuters thumbed through newspapers. Margaret leaned in and asked the obvious question, "Mr. Hart, you're not here to talk about yourself." Samuel offered a small smile. "No," he said, voice calm. "I'm here to talk about the millions who endure these microaggressions every day, who don't have a title to shield them, who don't have cameras rolling." Margaret nodded, pen poised. He recounted his upbringing in Oklahoma City, where his mother had taught him, "They see you before you speak, so never give them something to point at." He described the endless nights in freezing hangars, stripped of ego, building jets from the ground up. He painted the image of the white-gloved flight attendant whose cold indifference had scaled into a slap so publicly humiliating, and then he asked the question that cut to the heart. If I, as CEO, can be branded a fraud in first class, what happens to the ones without a platform to protest, without the power or the privilege to demand accountability? Margaret's eyes glistened with recognition, and a hush fell between their words. The article that appeared that evening ran not as a sensational exposé, but as a moral challenge. When titles don't protect you, a CEO reflects on what respect really means. Social media ignited not with shock, but with shared stories. Passengers of color, of age, of varied backgrounds recounting whispers, cold shoulders, curt refusals, tiny cracks in human dignity that had gone unremarked until now. At Norjet headquarters in San Bruno the day after the coffee shop interview, every department had copies of the Chronicle article pinned to their bulletin boards. The most piercing passage, "If respect is owed to every human, what have we been teaching our people to accept?" hung like a mirror. Samuel strode through the halls without a retinue, greeting analysts and baggage handlers alike. He needed to see their faces, gauge their reactions, feel the weight of this reckoning settling over the company. When he reached his office, he removed the manila folder from his desk drawer, the folder bulging with nearly 200 letters from passengers and employees. He thumbed through the pages. A gate agent passed over for promotion after 20 years of service. A flight attendant reprimanded for correcting a colleague's racist joke. A pilot who had overheard a whisper in coach that those people don't belong up front. Each letter was a dagger, each story a testament to the slow burn of disrespect that had hollowed out Norjet's core values over time. He drafted an internal memo with firm, deliberate language. Dignity is not earned by title, it is owed to every human being. Under my leadership, we will measure ourselves by how we treat the most vulnerable among us, no exceptions. When the memo hit inboxes, replies poured in. Some skeptical, some relieved, all engaged. He knew statements alone were empty promises unless accompanied by action, so he scheduled a company-wide town hall for the following Monday in the cavernous Skyview Auditorium. On Monday morning, the auditorium was packed. Gate agents from Chicago, mechanics from Miami, flight attendants from Los Angeles, pilots from Seattle, all stood shoulder to shoulder. Samuel took the stage, dressed in a simple navy suit, no tie. He began with the facts, recaps of the flight's events, the suspension of Kendra Whitlow, the press coverage. Then he paused and met each direction of the room with unflinching eyes. "This was not just one woman's failure," he said. "It was ours. When she slapped me, it cracked open a silent consensus that disrespect is acceptable. When it's convenient, when it's quiet, when it's what we've always done." A ripple went through the crowd. He continued, "We cannot pretend that bias only lives in headlines. It courses through hallways, lounges, terminals. It hides behind courtesy and politeness. It thrives in our comfort zones. Today, that ends." He unveiled Seat Check, a mandatory program requiring every flight attendant to rotate through all cabin classes and routes on a strict schedule. No more favoritism, no more rehearsed comfort. He introduced the Listening Line, a 24-hour anonymous hotline for passengers and staff, with guaranteed follow-up by an independent ombudsman. He announced that unconscious bias training would no longer be a single annual workshop, but an ongoing, immersive curriculum with quarterly simulations and real-time feedback loops. A hush fell as he concluded. Justice is not a single slap or a single press release. Justice is the sum of every policy we enforce, every heart we open, every apology we mean, and every voice we amplify. It's the promise I make to every one of you and to every person who ever boards a Norjet flight. The fallout was immediate and intense. Industry publications praised Norjet's sweeping reforms, the listening line as an unprecedented passenger empowerment tool. Competitors scrambled to retrofit their reporting processes. Union leaders hailed the move, and even the skeptics on the executive board applauded the clarity of Samuel's vision. Yet it was not victory so much as the beginning of a new, more arduous journey. Meanwhile, Kendra Whitlow's termination had become emblematic of accountability, or karmic payback, as some tabloids gleefully framed it. Footage from her prior altercation with a young Latino unaccompanied minor surfaced, painting a portrait of repeated cruelty. Public sentiment turned against her, but Samuel refused to add insult to injury. He declined interview requests about her relapse into aggressive behavior, insisting that his fight was not with one person's downfall, but with the systems that had allowed her cruelty to flourish unchecked. His restraint deepened public respect. People noticed that he carried no glee in her disgrace, only a cold determination to prevent future harm. Within weeks, Samuel was invited to speak at the annual Airline Leadership Conference in Phoenix. The convention center's ballroom filled with executives, consultants, and policymakers. Most came expecting the usual parade of profit forecasts and expansion plans. When Samuel stepped to the podium, he surprised everyone by launching not into strategy charts, but into the story of Flight 1627 from Love Field to San Francisco. The story of silent slights, of cold shoulders, of that explosive moment when a single slap laid bare decades of institutional neglect. His voice was steady and conversational. I didn't want anyone to see me as the CEO that day. I wanted to be seen as a person with a ticket, a body with tired bones, someone deserving of basic respect. If we cannot guarantee that to every person boarding our planes, then we are failing at the most fundamental level of our business. He paused while a hush spread across the room. Then he leaned forward. When justice is loud, it echoes only momentarily. When justice is quiet, persistent, systemic, it ripples through cultures and hearts long after the applause has faded. 9 months after that fateful flight, Norjet held its first Unity in the Skies symposium in Albuquerque, a summit gathering staff, passengers, community leaders, and human rights advocates. Samuel opened the event with a simple question: who here has felt invisible? Hands shot up across the room. He listened as they shared stories of exclusion and neglect, painting a collective tapestry of harm that spanned class, race, gender, age, and ability. Then, because he believed in leading by example, he shared his own story, from the freezing hangars to the polished first-class cabin, from the cold shove of contempt to the clarion call of change. He did not cast himself as hero, but as catalyst. When he finished, the room broke into spontaneous applause so thunderous it echoed in the mountains outside. On a crisp autumn morning, Samuel boarded Flight 247 to Chicago. Flying coach, he sat in seat 24F next to an elderly woman who offered him a kind smile. He returned it. When the flight attendant approached, she greeted him by name, Sam, even though he was in civilian clothes. She paused, recognition flickering in her eyes, and handed him a bottle of water with extra warmth. He lifted the bottle in silent thanks. Around him, the cabin hummed with respectful energy. When the attendant passed by later, he caught her eye and nodded. She nodded back. As the plane descended over Lake Michigan, Samuel gazed out at the city lights, recalling how a single act of cruelty had exposed a deeper sickness and how a steadfast insistence on justice had healed not only his own wounds, but the soul of an entire airline. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small card with 3 simple words printed on it: "Respect every passenger." He closed his hand around it, knowing that change never truly ends. It evolves, it deepens, it endures through each new flight, each new passenger, each new decision to speak up rather than look away. And somewhere in that vast sky between San Francisco and Chicago, Samuel Hart allowed himself a soft smile, certain that the ripples of one quiet moment would carry forward for generations of travelers to come.